Hello everyone and welcome to the School of Taste. I am Nick Jackson. Thank you for taking the time out to be with me today. If you are watching live, if you are watching on recording, thank you very much for taking the time to do that. I'm very pleased to start this new webinar course on understanding quality in wine. Today's the first session, and over the course of these next 4 webinars, we'll be looking at something which I think is really the ultimate question for wine professionals, which is how to understand quality in a glass of wine. You guys know me well. You know that I'm very fascinated by the way that wines taste according to where they come from or the variety that they're made from. And those things are very, very interesting. But as a commercial skill for wine professionals, I think the understanding quality is absolutely essential. So it's good just to dedicate some concentrated time to this one topic. We're going to explore this topic from a number of different angles. And today we're going to start with one region which is very famous for the way that it qualifies and constructs a hierarchy of quality, which is Burgundy. So if you're watching live, please do use the questions function at any point to submit your comments and questions, and I will try and get round to as many of them as I can. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Many of you will be very familiar with this idea, the idea of the quality hierarchy of wines in Burgundy, which applies both to red and to white wines. So the generic level wines that can come from anywhere in the Burgundy region, the village level wines, which have to come from one dedicated village, and then the Premier Cru wines and the Grand Cru wines, which clearly are individual single vineyard wines, and the Grand Cru just being considered to be a step up in quality from the Premier Cru. Now, who decides all these factors? Which are the classifications? In France, the appellation system, not just in Burgundy, but everywhere, is managed by an organization called the INAO. Now, here's the really interesting point about the INAO. They're not assessing wines, they're assessing sites. They're assessing places. They're not giving Grand Cru status or village status to wines. They're giving it to places, to geographical sites. Now, you may ask the question, how do we know the potential of these sites without tasting the wine? And I agree with you. I think it is a bit of a chicken and egg situation. I think really what happens is, as we've known for centuries, people have tasted these same wines from the same plots in Burgundy, and they've recognized that some plots simply year after year produce higher quality wines. This is why the INO have categorized this hierarchy of quality in Burgundy, and why they're so obsessive about maintaining the precise labeling, the terminology on the labels to give all consumers a clear indication of the quality level of the wine they're buying. So, geographical factors seem to be the reason why some sites in Burgundy have been classified as being higher quality than others. The reason we know that is if you look at the map of different Premier Crus and Grand Crus and village wines, they can be very close to each other, but they can have different quality levels. What kind of quality factors in a vineyard or in a site or in a place in Burgundy could contribute to producing different quality finished final wines? I think in this case, and this isn't really going to be the subject of today's session because I want to get onto the tasting, but I think we're talking about things like aspect, which way the vineyard faces. It faces east or south. We're talking about altitude. In Burgundy, in the Côte d'Or, there's a slope, for instance. Are you at the top of the slope or in the middle or at the bottom? That makes a difference. What kind of soils are you working with? Do you have a lot of topsoil, or are you planting almost right there on the bedrock? Things like this. Water availability, airflow, and probably some weird combination of all these things which is unquantifiable. These are the kind of geographical tiny little things that come together to ensure that each little site in Burgundy, vineyard to vineyard, sometimes there's only a stone wall between them or a road, can have very different effects on the final wine. Now we know, you can see I've written on there other regions in Europe. which have also got some kind of hierarchy of quality, where the vineyards are assessed for quality according to geographical features. But it's very clear to me, and this is the kind of overall lesson that I want to take from this part before we move on to the tasting, that quality here is somehow intimately tied up with geography. Whether it's because of those features I talked about or other aspects, it seems that after one other factor, geography in Burgundy is the most important thing. The other factor that determines quality, of course, is choice of variety. And this is not just in Burgundy, but everywhere around the world. Your selection of variety is going to be clearly the most important thing that determines the taste of the wine and of the quality. If you plant a superior variety, you're going to make better quality wine. But after that one factor, geography in Burgundy seems to contribute more to the quality hierarchy than any other factor. So in today's session and in next week's session, we're going to talk about geography. And the reason why I want to start with Burgundy in this first session is that I believe that nowhere else in the wine world do we see the effects of geography writ large across the wines. And obviously the INAO agrees with me because they've created this quite elaborate classification. But this begs, I guess, two questions. The first is the INAO classification correct? Are Premier Cru wines really superior to village wines? Are village wines obviously so much better than generic wines? And the second question is, how can we answer that first question from the wines that we have in the glass? What kind of methodology can we use to approach tasting with a view to assessing quality? We can't really assess the quality of a vineyard in any other way than to assess the wines. So our methodology must be about how to assess quality in the finished wines. So that brings me to our next slide. And this is a slide that you're going to get very familiar with during the course of these 4 webinars, because this to me is my sort of foundation for assessing quality, whatever the region, not just Burgundy, but wherever. This is the basis of my methodology for assessing quality in wines. Now, on this slide, you will see various quality factors listed. The idea here really is that if you assess each one of these individual components in the wine in your glass in front of you, that will start to give you some idea about the overall quality of the wine. But by itself, looking, say, just at aromatic expression, the first one, or just looking at ripeness, is obviously going to be insufficient to give you a wholesale picture about the quality of the wine. So what we really have to do is look at the levels of all of these different elements, put them together, and then try and come up with some overall assessment. So for instance, if you have high levels of all of those aspects that you can see listed here, then you're likely to have a high quality wine. And vice versa, if you only have moderate or low levels. So the idea is, my proposal for our session today is this, is that I will explain how to understand these categories, these quality factors in wine, while we're doing the tasting. I'll explain each one, and then we'll taste for each one. And then at the end of the tasting of the first 2 wines and then the next 2 wines, we'll make some kind of overall assessment about the quality of the wines that we're dealing with. So my suggestion is that we start with the 2 red wines. I hope that many of you have managed to find the wines. I suggested Bourgogne Rouge and a village wine, so we can see the generic level and then the village level, 2 different levels in red wines. As many of you know who have been to Burgundy, in Burgundy generally you taste the red wines first, and then you taste the white wines later. Probably the reason for this is the white wines are considered to kind of wash away the tannins. The acidity keeps everything fresh, so then you're either ready for another glass or you're ready for your next tasting or whatever. But you taste the red wines first and then the white wines second, so that's what we'll do today. Okay, so what I want to do when we're going through this list is to taste both the red wines together. So hopefully you've got 2 glasses. That would be fantastic, because then we can do a direct quality comparison between the Bourgogne Rouge and the village wine. Okay, so the first thing I want to consider is aromatic expression. So I will explain what I mean by each one of these, and then I will ask you guys to assess in your own wines the level of each category that you're getting. And I'll explain how to do all that. So aromatic expression, first of all. I guess there's 2 aspects to aromatic expression. One is intensity. How intense are the aromas and flavors that are coming out of the glass that you can smell? Are they light, or are they very serious and heady and really in your face? That's intensity of aroma. And then the other one, the other aspect of aromatic expression would be interest. How interesting are the aromas and flavors that you're getting? Do they make you want to keep on tasting, to keep on smelling, make you want to stop smelling and go on to taste the wine? Are they compelling aromas? So what I want you to do now is to smell first the Bourgogne Rouge. Don't taste, just smell it. Just smell the Bourgogne Rouge. And then give me a level of aromatic expression. Has it got a low level? That is, hasn't got much intensity of aromatic expression, and it doesn't have much interest in aromatic expression. Perhaps it's a bit simple. Give me, or is it moderate in those categories, or is it high? Just for the Bourgogne Rouge, and tell me what you think the level of the aromatic expression is. And again, this is sort of in a universal wine perspective, not just against other Burgundies you may or may not have tasted, or other Pinot Noirs or anything like that. So if the best wine you've ever tasted, which is a Chateau Margaux 1900 vintage, is like high for every one of these categories, that's your benchmark. And whereas like a $7 supermarket red wine from a big brand is low on everything, that would be your benchmark, and the other way around. Don't worry about like pluses and minuses. Let's just keep it simple today: low, moderate, high. So aromatic expression, your Bourgogne Rouge, what's the aromatic expression? You have a low level of that, high level, somewhere in the middle. And again, for the purposes of this, it doesn't really matter too much what the aromas and flavors are of, unless, and this is something which we'll come on to in the later points, unless the aromas and flavors are kind of off-putting for some reason. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So for Gianluca, Alberto, and Edgar, you've all got moderate. Corey is saying moderate for Bourgogne. Lynn is just saying low for Bourgogne. Alice is saying moderate. Amber is saying moderate aromatic expression. Nothing really compelling about it. Good. Michelle is saying low. Neil's saying moderate. And Nupa and Kirsten are also going with moderate. So we've got quite a few moderates there. Now I want you to switch glasses and go across to the village wine and do the exact same thing. Just give me the level on the village wine that you have. And it's totally fine, by the way, if it's the same level. I'm not trying to prove anything. It's your wines. Everyone's got different wines. And like I said at the beginning, we're asking the question of the INAO, whether their quality levels in their classifications are correct or not. If they're not, then we might not see different levels. But it can be helpful just to compare 2 glasses at once, just on these factors. So they really, first of all, you understand what the factors are and how to assess them, but also they really bring out any contrast between the wines, where if you're only tasting one at a time, it can be a little difficult to put it in context. Lars is saying moderate for the Bourgogne Rouge that he has. Gianluca is saying moderate for the village wine. Alice, meanwhile, is saying high for the village wine. Neil is saying low intensity but better appeal. Okay, good. So contrast there between what I'm calling the intensity of the aromas and the interest of the aromas. Good. Lynn is saying moderate both for interest and intensity for the village wine. Fleur is also making a distinction between the intensity, which is only moderate but more alluring aromas, Fleur says, for the village wine than for the Bourgogne Rouge. Corey's saying medium or medium plus for the village wine. Good. Okay, so quite a few moderates here, but a lot of people are commenting that there's a different type or quality or allure or interest to the aromas in the village wine, which is good. Philip's saying high intensity for the Gevrey Chambertin that he has. Very good. Kirsten's saying much more interesting. Good. I like these points. Okay, good. So even if we say moderate for both of them, which seems to be sort of the way we're going here across the board, there does seem to be a suggestion that the village wine has got a bit more interest somehow, a bit more complexity perhaps a bit more sensuality, something to keep you smelling coming back to the glass. So maybe aromatic expression is moderate for both of them, but if you were going to use pluses and minuses, which I said we wouldn't, but maybe we should, maybe for the village wine, overall an aromatic expression, combining the intensity and the interest, you'd end up with moderate plus, so maybe a little bit higher for the village wine. Okay, ripeness. Let's talk about the next factor, how to assess ripeness in the glass. Ripeness is a real serious virtue in wine. Any old textbook will tell you that the best sites in wine are the ones where ripeness is achieved most easily. Now, I say old textbooks because increasingly in this world of climate change and warming temperatures, ripeness is something that can come reasonably easy to many regions in Europe and around the world, which used to be formerly even rather marginal. And in Burgundy, honestly, we're in, this is a great case in point, where this is a region where chaptalization, just to get to 12% alcohol, 12.5% alcohol, was absolutely standard until probably the beginning of the 21st century. And now the conversation has totally shifted towards, we're going to harvest in August, we're going to harvest on the 1st of September, a full month earlier, things like that than we used to. So ripeness is not so much of an issue, but nonetheless, ripeness is still a very important one for winemakers. In red wines, unripeness betrays itself by hard tannins, by perhaps an overall sense of some kind of chalkiness or dryness in the palate, maybe quite slimline fruit, not very generous, a bit austere overall, and often the acidity and the tannin will dominate on the finish. In white wines, underripeness is not usually such an issue, but if you do get underripeness in white, what tends to happen is the fruit is very thin and the acidity is very high, so they're kind of out of balance there. But ripeness in red wines exhibits itself as generosity of fruit, really a fruit which is velvety and rich, even on sort of more simple wines. You don't even have to have fine wines, but the fruit is generous. And in white wines, likewise. So ripeness, as I'll explain a bit later, we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but ripeness can be both smelled on the nose and tasted on the palate, so make sure you taste as well. And then we'll see the reason why ripeness is a precondition for everything else in just a sec. But the question for this one, as you're tasting the two wines, is what's the level of ripeness in your wine? High ripeness doesn't mean over ripeness, it just means it's perfectly ripe and the fruit is pleasant and juicy or whatever. Whereas low ripeness would mean the wine is hard and tough and maybe acidic. So overall, in ripeness terms, you can taste the two wines together. You don't need to go one at a time, and just tell me whether they have the same level of ripeness or whether the village wine has greater ripeness. I mean, I do think in general, when these classifications about vineyard sites were made, ripeness was a huge contributing factor to them. I still often think to myself, in the world of white Burgundy, these days I often prefer some Premier Crus to Grand Crus, because sometimes Grand Crus can be so rich and so heavy that it kind of is a bit overwhelming, whereas Premier Crus can be a little bit more taut, a bit more linear, a bit more refreshing. Those virtues which I think are, you know, essentially Burgundian virtues in white wines. Alberto is saying higher ripeness in the village wines. Neil is saying both wines are fully ripe, but not overripe. Good. If you guys purchased wines off the shelf for this session, then you probably had 2018, which is certainly a riper vintage in Burgundy. 2017, which is not so ripe, but certainly not unripe. I actually really like 17s because of the combination of freshness and pure expression of the place and of the variety. Michelle saying the Bourgogne Rouge is thin and quite tart, so less ripe. So I think that's a really good description of something being not very ripe, thin and quite tart for the Bourgogne Rouge. Lynn saying village wine is not only riper, it has a seamless ripeness. Good. The Bourgogne is a bit out of balance with the acidity prominent and a hint of greenness. Yeah, I mean, you know, greenness in a red wine is usually a symptom of under ripeness, although some varieties like the Bordeaux varieties have that as a kind of natural note, but it does seem to get exaggerated by under ripeness. The village is riper for Kirsten. The Bourgogne Rouge is a bit savory and austere. Good. Village wine for Lars is more subtle and more generously fruit driven compared to the Bourgogne Rouge. Good. For Amber, the Bourgogne Rouge is a mix of sour, slightly underripe red fruit and riper red fruit, but the village level is all ripe fruit. A great contrast there. That there is some ripe fruit in the Bourgogne Rouge, but there's still some slightly acidic notes, whereas in the village wine, it's just ripe all the way through. I love that. Okay. Corey's just making the comment that both of his wines are ripe, but you get to the depth and the concentration. That's when you experience a difference. So let's talk about that now. So I think on balance, ripeness seems to be a bit more favored towards the village wines, although some people had plenty of ripeness in the Bourgogne Rouge. Complexity. How do you taste complexity in a wine? I hope, by the way, the first point to say about complexity is that this long laundry list here of quality factors is enough to convince you that complexity alone is not enough. That's what you might naturally think, that when we're talking about fine wine, we're talking about complex wines, but complexity is just one element. But it is a very important one. Complexity, very simply for me, the way I assess it is how many different aromas and flavors can I smell and can I taste going on at once. So of course you get fruit flavors, that's a given. Do you in addition get any winemaking notes? Is there any oak integration or lack of it? And is there any kind of other notes, either through bottle age or just through the native expression of the place, such as in Burgundy red, undergrowth or wet leaves or mushrooms, or those general kind of earthy things which characterize older red Burgundy, but sometimes you get them in younger wines as well. Do you find any of those notes? Because those are three different types of things, right? Fruit, winemaking, some kind of mature or mineral notes. So if they're all going on at once, you've got a complex wine. Or is it simply fruit? That's okay too. So that to me is a question about complexity. So what level of complexity do you find between the two wines? Is there a difference? A lot of people say that the biggest step up in this Burgundy hierarchy, the four big categories, is between village wine and Premier Cru. But I think sometimes there can be quite a big step up between Bourgogne and village wine as well. I'm interested to see what you guys have to say. And Corey's saying it's much more spice on the village wine. Nupa is saying fleshier for the village wine, so I assume that's going back to the ripeness discussion. What do the rest of you guys think? Fleur is making the point that could complexity also include texture. The village wine is softer and more lush on the palate, which is also textural. Yeah, and I think that's also a question about ripeness. Remember, I was hinting earlier on that ripeness is almost like the precondition for everything else. And I think the ripeness is a great contributor to texture as well. Like we were talking about, sometimes unripe wines can be a bit thin or hard or green or austere, someone said, whereas ripe wines usually have got a very nice texture. But certainly texture can be an element that contributes to complexity. Yeah, I agree, Fleur. That's a great point. So make sure everyone to take into consideration texture. How do you assess texture? Well, if the wine just slides over your tongue and you don't really notice it in neither a good or a bad way, it's perfectly fine. But if you feel like the wine is really caressing your palate or your tongue, or you just feel like it's leaving behind this really high quality feel, a really lush feel that you like to sort of linger on, that's usually a sign of high quality texture. The only thing I would say about texture, I mean, texture is kind of a wonderful given in Pinot Noir, one of the great varieties for texture. But sometimes, and I think it is good to look at it in the context of Burgundy and of Pinot Noir, but in the context of some wines, like for instance, Gewürztraminer, it's got an oily texture. I don't know whether Gewürztraminer having an oily texture is necessarily a positive or a negative, because that's quite a weird and unusual texture, and some people will like it and some people won't. So in this case, I agree texture is a part of quality or complexity, but not necessarily in all cases. Corey commenting, the difference is so marked in terms of complexity, so much more going on in the village wine. Lynn saying fewer elements are obvious in the Bourgogne Rouge than in the village wine. There is more there in the village wine, says Lynn. Yes, good summary, Lynn. Alberto agrees, a lot more going on in the village wine. Amber is asking a question, how much does what village it is contribute to the gap, the big gap, as Amber says, between Bourgogne and village? I don't feel there's that much of a difference between Bourgogne Rouge and Marsanne, but I suspect at Volnay or Gevrey there would be more difference. It's a tough question, isn't it? Because not many winemakers will state on the label for their Bourgogne Rouge where the grapes come from. So the Bourgogne Rouge grapes could come from the Côte Chalonnaise, and then you're trying to compare that to a village level Vosne Romanée, is probably not a fair fight. So if we could compare Bourgogne Rouge grapes that come from the wrong side of the road in Gevrey, where it's literally across the road is Gevrey-Chambertin village wines, then that would be more of a fair fight. But, you know, I think Burgundy geeks do sort of have a hierarchy in their mind of the quality of certain villages. You know, Vosne, Chambol, and Gevrey, and the Côte de Nuits, and Volnay, and the Côte de Beaune would be considered to be, you know, the top villages. And then the next rank would be Nuits-Saint-Georges and Pommard. And then, you know, maybe you get on to places like Santenay and the Côte Chalonnaise and places like that. But I mean, those are niche distinctions. So of course the answer is yeah, there are definitely differences according to where the grapes come from, but we should also take into consideration where the grapes for the Bourgogne Rouge come from. And that's why I'm actually really pleased that there is now this new appellation, which I think 2018 was the first vintage for Bourgogne Côte d'Or, which means that the grapes for Bourgogne Rouge with that name on it must come from the Côte d'Or and not from further south. So I think that's a good step forward. Alice saying the Bourgogne Rouge seems a bit one-dimensional next to the village wine. Neil saying the village is much more complex and compelling. Bourgogne Rouge is fresh fruit, spice and acid, but the village adds earthiness, toast, oak, texture. Great, I love that. I love that. Perfect definition of what differences in complexity mean. How do you assess complexity in a very young wine with no tertiary characteristics and is made in a style with minimal winemaking? Well, I mean, in a way, Catherine, I think that makes it's a very pure test because there's nothing getting in the way between you and the expression of the fruit. And then it's up to you to assess how complex that fruit is. Is it one-dimensional cherryade? Or are there layers of different red fruits, maybe a hint of black and then some spice as well? In Burgundy, all those things could be considered terroir notes. So in a way, I love it when you do get really restrained winemaking, so you're just tasting the fruit because it sets up a really fair test. Noop is saying, making a contrast between multi-dimensional village wine and one-dimensional Bourgogne Rouge. Lars saying the village wine is more chiseled. Oh, Neil is correcting me. Bourgogne Côte d'Or, the new appellation I was just talking about, 2017 is the first vintage, not 2018, as I said. So thank you for that, Neil. I appreciate it. Okay, so complexity, it seems like village wine does win out for almost everyone. Concentration of fruit. Concentration of fruit, you detect fruit on your tongue. That's where you feel the fruit. The question about concentration of fruit is very simple. Does that fruit on your tongue feel like concentrated, dense, pure fruit? Or does it feel, on the other hand, a bit watery? That there is some fruit there, but there's also some stuff which is a bit light. It doesn't really stand up to that level of the really pure concentrated fruit. Imagining diluting, I don't know, like a children's drink, where, you know, made from a syrup. You dilute it with a certain amount of water, so it's made from concentrate. How concentrated on the tongue is the fruit in your wine? Of course, this is totally wrapped up with ripeness. Again, I talked about how important ripeness would be. Ripe fruit allows for complexity of fruit flavors, and also it allows for concentration of fruit. So generally speaking, if you have a ripe wine, you will also have concentration of fruit. Those two will go hand in hand. And we all see that repeatedly, that there's overlap between these categories. But concentration of fruit in really good wines is essential. It's a given. In Pinot Noir, it can be a little bit of a weird one to assess, because clearly Pinot Noir is not a bodybuilder wine. It's not massive and dense and inky colored or anything like that. But that's not, don't focus so much on the weight of that weight on your tongue, of the fruit on your tongue. Focus on how concentrated that fruit is, or whether it's a bit watery. Edgar misread the instructions, so he got a village wine and a Premier Cru. What a terrible mistake, Edgar. Well, you've got the best wines of any of us today. The village has wonderful fruit, but the Premier Cru is so much more interesting and multidimensional. Good. Corey saying concentration of fruit and depth is the key here. So I like the word depth. I appreciate Corey bringing the word depth up. You can have depth to the fruit. That's similar to concentration as well. There's a lot of depth and concentration in Corey's wine. The son is asking, could a wine have low intensity of overripe fruit, like, for instance, a jug wine from the New World, versus higher intensity of underripe fruit? I don't know, Sonny. I think you might be overthinking it a little bit. When it comes to underripeness and overripeness and jamminess and dried fruits and notes and things like that, we're talking about ripeness. If the ripeness is overripe, it's almost just as bad as it being underripe. So if you're going to mark down a wine for having underripe or overripe characters, I'd put it under the ripeness thing, not under the concentration of fruit thing. If a wine had raisin flavors but still had concentrated fruit, you'd have to give it the concentration of fruit. You'd just say the ripeness was not correct. Gianluca, is concentration of fruits, does that overlap with persistence and finish? Yes, absolutely. And we will come on to that when we talk about those categories. But for now, let's just think about the concentration and the depth of the fruit on the tongue, on the palate. Lars is commenting the village wine feels like it covers a large number of taste buds. It has a more lasting impression compared to the Bourgogne Rouge. Yeah, exactly. And just remember what you just said there, Lars, because I'm also going to talk about that. Talk about the way that the flavors of the wine can coat the mouth when we talk about intensity of flavor. But here I'm just talking about how concentrated that fruit feels on the tongue. The reason why I keep on going on about this concentration thing is that it's very important for wine aging as well. You really need good concentration in a wine for it to be age-worthy, for it to improve with time as the fruit kind of unravels or relaxes. If the wine doesn't have much concentration to start with, it's got nowhere to go to. And the ability of a wine to age is fundamental to assessing its quality. We'll talk about that later today. Okay, so concentration of fruit, probably a little bit more in the village wines. Tell me if you find something else. Lynn is saying the Bourgogne Rouge spreads over the palate but has no real depth, like a surface film. Good. The village wine is more focused. Yeah, so focused would be another way of putting it. You feel a real focus of fruit, a depth of fruit, concentration of fruit. Good. So yeah, so I think again, the village wine comes out on top on concentration. Balance. Balance seems like a very academic one, right? But actually it's vitally important for making good wine to have a balanced wine. Simply, the very easiest way to understand balance in a wine is no elements of the wine stick out. So the alcohol doesn't stick out, the acidity doesn't stick out, the fruit doesn't overwhelm everything, the oak doesn't stick out. What balances the problem with what happens if any of those elements do stick out is that they become an impediment to you enjoying your glass of wine, because the sticking out thing makes you stop and think about that factor. Whereas in a balanced wine, when all the factors, the different elements of the wine are in harmony with one another, the wine just flows effortlessly across your palate. One very smart wine person I know said, in a balanced wine, there is no opposition to the wine being drunk. And I love that. Whereas anything that's out of balance puts up an obstacle or a barrier to enjoying the wine, to drinking the wine. It may stop you wanting to have another glass. In the particular case of red Burgundy, I've made the point here of mentioning acidity and fruit. So the issue, again, this is a ripeness issue. In unripe vintages, what often happens in red Burgundy is the acidity can be very high. And you kind of feel like the weight or the concentration or the depth of fruit is not enough to balance the acidity. So you're left tasting a lot of acidity, but there's not enough fruit to make up for it. Michelle commenting the Bourgogne Rouge is thin or lacking concentration, but there's more fruit, more weight of fruit in the village wine. Yeah, exactly. Michelle saying, is Barolo out of balance in that case? So there's a lot of acidity in Barolo, but there's also a lot of fruit. It may have an unusual framework, and you may not feel it quite in the same places. And the other thing about Barolo is that with the Nebbiolo variety, the fruit emerges over time as well. And that's one of the essential elements to aging, bottle aging, Nebbiolo wines. But let's not get distracted. So balance in general, what do you guys think? Do you find any acidity sticking out anywhere, or really any other elements, tannins, or maybe the tannins are too dry in one of the examples, or I assume you don't get any alcohol that sticks out. But usually it's the balance of the acidity in the fruit in Burgundy that's important. Yeah, Alberto, I'm thinking about fruit, whether it's too light or too heavy. I'm thinking about tannin, alcohol, acidity. If the wine was a dessert wine or a sweet wine, we consider whether there was enough or too much sugar, but not relevant here. Sometimes, yeah, oak, winemaking, other elements. Kirsten commenting that the acidity overpowers the fruit in the Bourgogne Rouge, but the village is very well balanced. Balance between the fruit and the acidity, good. Neil saying the Bourgogne Côte d'Or is slightly over acidic, but the Vosne Romanée is seamless. Yeah, good. Michelle commenting the Bourgogne Rouge has not got a lot of fruit on the palate and is very tart. So again, you see the connection between ripeness, concentration, and balance. So we're now getting to the point where we can see how the overlap between all these different features of the wine. I'm trying to categorize them very clearly, delineating between the different quality factors, but in fact, they all kind of overlap and interweave with each other. I do think ripeness really foregrounds a lot of the others. But good, there does seem to be a lot of agreement in general about village wine being a bit more seamless, having a bit better balance between the fruit and the acidity than the Bourgogne Rouge. Intensity of flavor, we were just talking about concentration of fruit, the fruit on the tongue. Here I'm talking about flavor, and I'm talking about the extent to which the flavor coats the inside of your mouth and you feel it persistently on the finish as well. So wines with low intensity of flavor, yes, they taste of something, sure, but there's no real sense of those flavors making much of an impression on your nose or on your palate or on the finish. They just sort of, they're there and then they're gone. Whereas wines with great intensity of flavor, they just penetrate all corners of your mouth and then they just keep on going on the finish as well. That's what I'm looking for in intensity of flavor. And that's got nothing to do with how dense or heavy a wine is. So in fact, something like a Pinot Noir can be a great way to understand intensity of flavor, because in quite a light-bodied wine, you can nonetheless have a lot of intensity of flavor. And I hope you guys do, maybe especially in your village examples. but do you see a difference in intensity of flavor between the Bourgogne Rouge and the village wine? Emil, your complicated question, I think you're really asking is, isn't texture just a result of alcohol and fruit and acid coming together? Yes, but texture in the way that we're talking about it is a portmanteau word that draws all those things together in a way that we can understand as sensory beings. So I think it is very useful to talk about texture, as long as you don't stop talking about the other elements of the wine as well, right? I think that is important. I think this question about texture has come up because we're tasting Pinot Noir, just a wonderfully textured variety. I don't think we often talk about texture. Not to say that we shouldn't, we should, but we often don't talk about it so much with, say, the Bordeaux varieties. Maybe more with the kind of dusty, grainy Italian varieties in red wine. But definitely it's such an obvious and pertinent feature of Pinot Noir. Lynn agrees about ripeness. The acidity sticks out in the Bourgogne Rouge, while the village is more seamless. Good. Alice, the acidity stands out more on the village wine, just the same thing. Good. On the Bourgogne Rouge, the fruit disappears on the finish, whereas the village fruit more present on the palate and the flavors last a moderate amount of time. Good. Lynn, the intensity trajectory of the village wine is notably great, but without heaviness. Good. So intensity of flavor is a bit of an abstract concept to get your head around, but I'm looking for how piercing and how powerful and focused the flavor is, not the fruit, but the flavors. Okay, finally, and we've just addressed this in part with our conversation about intensity being felt on the finish as well. Let's think about the length and the quality of the finish. So length is not only how long you feel the flavors of the wine last for. Good wines, you can taste them for 20, 30 seconds or longer. Poor wines, everyday, simple, cheap wines, the flavors disappear almost immediately. But it's also about the quality of the finish. Again, do we get a lovely harmony of flavors, maybe the winemaking flavors, the fruit, any bottle age flavors or any other flavors, mineral? Do they continue going all the way through? Or maybe some of them get left behind and we get a lot of acid or we get a lot of tannin in place. So you might still taste something, but it may not be something that you want to taste. If the wine was struggling for ripeness in the first place, maybe you're tasting tannins or greenness or acidity. So think both about how long you taste the wine for in the finish, and also the quality of that finish. Is it a nice fruity finish which carry the complex flavors all the way through? Lars is saying the intensity of the flavor manifests itself on the mid palate, on the tongue, where the Bourgogne Rouge tapers off, but the village wine stays persistent on the finish. Yeah, good. I think that is a good way of understanding the difference between the two quality levels. Going through these points as I have just done like this is a little tedious and a little academic, and I know you guys can all do this in your sleep. But we're going to use this paradigm for all the rest of the webinars in this course. And so I won't make you do what we just did for all the wines. Don't worry, that would not be very interesting. But just do it once so we know what we're looking for. And so we have a sort of shorthand in our language that we can all agree about, at least the vocabulary that we're using to describe these different elements. I'm not going to talk about the bottom 5 points right now. We'll talk about those in the context of the white wines we're tasting. Sarah's asking me I have a verbal tick where I equate mid palate with tongue. So to me, wines have a stopping point, which is not right when you first taste them, and it's not on the finish, but it's in the middle. And the wine almost stops for a few seconds. And in the middle, you taste the fruit, which is why I call it the mid palate, because it's in the middle of the experience of the time when the wine is on your palate. But where you taste that fruit is on the tongue. So really, mid palate and fruit mean the same thing. So maybe people use it differently, but that's what I mean by it when I say that. Gianluca, more depth on the village wine that helps the overall balance and the finish. Good. The Bourgogne Rouge ends a bit bitter on the finish and is shortish for Kirsten. The village wine has a longer finish with fruit through to the end. Alberta is saying, what do you mean by quality of the finish? Is that about how consistently it remains on the palate or how complex it is? Yeah, more like how complex it is, Alberto, whether you keep on tasting the fruit and all the other flavors as well, or whether it just is either a bit simple and fruity on the finish, or even worse, it becomes a bit of an acid or tannin mess. The fruit kind of dissipates. Okay, so what we've done with these two wines is we've looked at these 7 quality factors, and we've assessed the ways they express themselves differently at 2 different levels of the Burgundy hierarchy. Of course, everyone's got different wines, but there does seem to be some consensus that each one of these categories is expressed more fully or at a higher level in the village wine than in the Bourgogne Rouge. Notwithstanding any things like, different vintages and stuff like that, which kind of complicate the picture. But in general terms, the village wine seems to show more of all of those things than the Bourgogne Rouge. So all those quality factors put together indicate that the village wine is of a higher quality than the Bourgogne Rouge. Now, that's no surprise to you. It's no surprise to me. It does answer our first question, at least, which is the INAO hierarchy correct? And it seems on the basis of the tasting that we just did, using at least this setup for approaching tasting for quality, that it is correct, which is kind of reassuring. But this is just the very beginnings of understanding quality in wine. So what I want to do now is taste the 2 Chablis wines, the 2 whites, and I want to add a few more factors to our understanding of quality to give us a bit more vocabulary, a bit more depth of our understanding of quality. So prepare your 2 Chablis wines, and we'll do just the same thing. We will taste them together. I hope you were able to find a village wine and a Premier Cru. Maybe some of you got a Grand Cru, even better. But pour those now, and we will do a similar kind of analysis to what we just did, but a little bit quicker. So it's not quite so drawn out, because now you guys know the way that we're approaching this kind of tasting. Lynn is asking, how much should we factor in that it's likely a producer will lavish more care on and attention on a wine of an appellation that can be sold for a higher price? Of course, very important. But equally well, you can flip the question on its head and say, well, if the wine is just not that concentrated in the first place, then I'm not going to lavish much attention on it. I'm not going to buy new oak for it. I'm not going to do elaborate winemaking for it. I'm not going to rack it all the time or do batonnage all the time, because really there isn't enough ripeness there to justify it. And in any case, with this quality of wine, most people are going to drink it within the first 3 to 5 years after release, when the wine is still fresh and fruity. So those kind of winemaking techniques wouldn't really benefit it. I'm just going to say this now while you guys are pouring your white wines. But some people do actually think that the hierarchy system for quality in Burgundy is overstated, and that if producers would look after their vineyards at different quality levels to the same extent that they do their Grand Crus, if you'd look after your Bourgogne Rouge vineyard as much as you look after your Grand Cru, you can make considerably better wine. But just because they have limits on manpower and laborers and finances, honestly, then of course the more expensive appellations will get more time. But if any of you have ever been lucky enough to taste the wines from Domaine or Maison Leroy, L-E-R-O-Y, then she is making wines that would say the hierarchy system is almost irrelevant if you really look after your vines, because you can taste her Bourgogne Rouges and village wines, and they are better than many people's Grand Crus. So those interesting philosophical question marks do hang out there. Okay, so let's do this quickly. Compare the 2 Chablis wines. Tell me which one has got the better aromatic expression, and then any interesting or unexpected aromas that you're getting out of whichever one is better. What kind of jumps out the glass at you in terms of aromas? And is there a big difference? Is there a big difference in the quality or the level of aromatic expression between the 2? And while you're doing that, you can also think, just on the nose, of course, just on the nose, you can also think about ripeness. In Chablis, can you tell ripeness on the nose? I'm sure you can on the palate in terms of richer fruit, rounder, riper, softer, but can you tell it on the nose as well? Is that also wrapped up with aromatic expression? You don't worry about that too much, but if you happen to think about it, happen to notice it when you're smelling these two wines, then please comment in. I'd be interested to hear. Clearly, you know, we're going further north in Chablis now, so we are not going to get so much ripeness as we just had, even bearing in mind the change in color that we're dealing with. But I think nonetheless that Chablis is one of those regions where perhaps even because it's a cooler climate, these gradations, the quality hierarchy can be quite visible and interesting. Corey is commenting that the village wine is way more open and aromatic than the Premier Cru, which is shut down. So it's super interesting because in a way you'd expect the reverse, right? Which is the Premier Cru would have better aromatic expression. Corey's saying it's the other way around. But in a relatively young wine, I think Corey said it was 2018, then sometimes higher quality wines can be closed aromatically and on the palate sometimes. So it kind of works the opposite way around. And often this happens from the most ambitious producers who are making age-worthy wines that are meant to improve and improve and improve in the bottle. So that's an interesting point. So just bear that in mind if you have any difficulties with the Premier Cru. Philip commenting more going on in the Premier Cru, but neither is too intense. Okay. Lynn is saying the Premier Cru has more of everything. It's the village wine on steroids. Okay, good. Neil, everything has got more in the vial. Vion Premier Cru compared to the village wine, depth and concentration. Alice, the village wine smells of tartar fruit from the Premier Cru. So a comment about ripeness. So please, if you haven't done so already, taste the wine now and see whether you get more ripeness, more soft, rich, round fruit, more generosity of fruit on the palate. Lars commenting the Premier Cru is more intense, but also showing more savory reductive notes. So going back to Corey's comments on about how the more ambitious wine can be a bit more shut down aromatically in some cases. The generic Chablis village level is more one-sided, one-dimensional yet fruity. So that's also a statement about complexity. We can move on to talk about complexity aromatically as well. That when you guys say expressions like there's a lot more going on, I understand that to mean more going on in flavor terms, so more complexity. Good. Anupa making a comment comparing village and Grand Cru, moderate aromatic expression, but so different, steely aromatically in the village wine, but fleshier in the Grand Cru. So again, ripeness, ripeness, ripeness. Sarah making an interesting distinction. The village wine is louder, but more one note. The Premier Cru is quieter, but more defined, more precise maybe. Michelle, green fruits, fairly one-dimensional. Grand Cru, more complex. So already both on the, some people are already tasting the wine on the palate, but already on the nose, people are getting complexity aromatically here. Yeah, so Amber also commenting on the ripeness. The Premier Cru adds stone fruit to with just the citrus fruit at village level. Sure. Okay, very good. So talk to me now about the elements on the palate. Let's talk about concentration of fruit, balance, and intensity of flavor. So how concentrated the fruit is, whether the wine is in balance. I think probably it's going to be the fruit acid balance again. Maybe though, if you have a Premier Cru or Grand Cru from a warm vintage like 2018, there could be an issue with alcohol. There could also be an issue at these higher quality levels with oak, how well integrated the oak is. And then think about the intensity of flavor, how penetrating it is, how much it kind of marks the edges of your mouth and the finish with focused flavor. Think about that. Edgar making the comment that the village level fruit is thinner, leaner. Yeah, so just what we saw in the Bourgogne Rouge as well. One thing, if you can do it in your head, and this is like, it's a bit of a, it kind of messes with your mind a little bit. But remember, we are working up the quality pyramid in Burgundy here. It's just that we've switched color. So we had a generic wine. We've now had 2 village wines. And now we've got a Premier Cru or a Grand Cru as well. So here's a question for you. In terms of the concentration of fruit or the intensity of flavor, did the two village wines have similar levels? But when you're thinking about that question, you've also got to take into consideration the different climate. You know, we're 100 miles further north in Chablis. So is the fruit going to be as generous? Is it a fair comparison? Or is there an overall sense of harmony and balance between all the elements in both wines that they are comparable? Just interesting to think. Edgar making the comment that there's much more minerality in the Premier Cru, so I put that down to a complexity note. Amber is saying the acid fruit balance is the most startling for me. Both the Village and the Premier Cru come in with the roundness of Chardonnay, but the acid in the Village is more jagged, spiky, and stands out compared to the more seamless integration of the acidity in the Premier Cru wine. Yeah, fantastic. The reason I go on and on about acid in terms of balance is that I think it's something which is massively under-discussed, not just in white wines, but in red wines and in great wines as well. So people in the fine wine world often talk about decanting, and people think that you mean to decant for air or you decant to get rid of sediment, and all those things are true. But to me, the number one benefit of decanting is to integrate the acidity. If you ever have a wine where the acidity is out of joint and you don't think it should be, it's not Sauvignon Blanc or something, there's no reason why the acidity should be out of joint, then decant it. Come back to it half an hour later, and hopefully you'll find the acidity is integrated into the fruit more. Philip, the Premier Cru is more body and complexity. Part of that is probably riper fruit, but part of it is also because the basic level has no oak, and the Premier Cru has got a little new oak, right? So the oak is adding a bit of complexity as well. Neil's saying the Premier Cru has got greater focus than the Village wine and more concentration and precision in the latter. Michelle's saying if you have a closed Grand Cru wine that's high in concentration or intensity, how do you get to quality? Well, you decant it, obviously. No, so this often happens in Burgundy in both colors, right? That the wine just seems totally closed, that you can't really interpret it because nothing is expressing itself, not on the nose, not on the palate, not anywhere. So in that case, the only thing that I can think of to do is to expose it more to air and to let it breathe a little bit and just let it relax and unfurl. Not much help right now, I know, but that's what I would do if I was at home. Lars saying the Premier Cru example is textured and mouth coating. The Village wine is more disparate. Yeah, good. Okay, so what I want to, and just finally on the length, did you notice an appreciable difference in length, or are we more tasting just the flavors and that just continue the same Chablis flavors, citrus, maybe some stone fruit, maybe some chalky minerality? Is anyone getting any kind of saline, seashelly notes, any oyster shell, those kind of cool notes that you get in Chablis? You finding that? But think about the length, not only how long you keep on tasting it for, but whether all the complexity of the wine, which I hope you have in a nice Chablis, whether that continues all the way through, or whether you're left on acid. Another factor that you can be left on is oak, which to my mind is not good news. If you get left with oak on the finish and the fruit is nowhere obvious, then the winemaking is a bit out of balance with the rest of the wine. So that would be a balance issue. And I don't ever want to end up on oak. That's not a good question. Sarah's saying that she gets the chalky notes in the Premier Cru wine, but none in the Village wine. Good. So minerality at the higher quality example. Lynn's saying more and more cohesive length on the Premier Cru. So cohesive, I take to mean integrated, all the elements of the wine integrated on the finish. Definitely longer finish with more complexity on the Premier Cru for Philip. And he also comments that the Village wine has actually got great minerality on the finish. It just doesn't have much else. Okay, so what you can actually have, and again, this goes back to our question about the age of the wine and how ready it is to drink, is that you sometimes get is that the Village wine, the lower level wine, can be quite open and attractive and nice. And you're like, oh, wow, this is a fantastic wine. Whereas like we were just talking about, the higher status wine can be kind of closed in on itself and not very expressive, meaning that it's quite hard to distinguish in quality between the two. But as you do this all the time in your tastings at home, professionally, here's a question for you to think about, which is this wine showing me everything that it's got right now, or will there be more to come next year or in a few years? Because if there will be, then that's going to be the better wine. Often wines which are very flattering today may be very great today, but really don't have much more of a future other than what they're showing right now. Amber, do you think it's common to see Oak, Chablis, and Premier and Grand Cru on wine exams? Yeah, I think Oak is still very common in Chablis at both Premier Cru and Grand Cru level. I know that a lot of producers are reining back on that Oak in Chablis at all levels, but I think it's still common enough that it would be perfectly legitimate to put it on an exam as a classic example. Okay, so let's talk about these last 5 points. The reason why I didn't talk about these last 5 points when it came to the red wines is because I think these last 5 points are more appropriate for discussing higher level examples. So they may be relevant to the village level wine, but they're especially relevant to the Premier Cru. And for those of you who've got Grand Cru, even more so. So let's talk about these. These are aspects of quality which we can talk about, which you should consider when you're in the presence of a good or very good or outstanding wine. They're not relevant to talk about when you've got a $10 wine. Okay, first of all, age worthiness, I just touched on it. How do you tell whether, well, first of all, age worthiness is considered a virtue in wine because the ability of a wine to improve with age is treasured by collectors. But how do you tell whether that's going to happen? In white wines, since we're on white wines, I think it's that sense that we've just been talking about everything being quite tight and quite coiled. But if there's concentration of fruit and there's intensity of flavor and a long finish, then all those things should unfold with bottle age. So if you have all those things in place, concentration, intensity, length, and an overall sense that this could be more expressive or perhaps should be more expressive than what it is, then the likelihood is that wine is going to improve as it opens up with age. In red wines, I think it's a bit more obvious. I think we're talking about tannins softening, mellowing, so there's no austerity from the tannins, and integrating into the fruit a bit more. And then the tertiary elements coming out aromatically as well. So age worthiness. Age worthiness is generally considered a virtue in wine. So if you think, based on those things I just described, your wine could age, then it's got a high level, moderate level of age worthiness, then that's going to add to the quality of the wine. Transcending variety, this is my sort of more abstract, this is my kind of more abstract point. Let me ask you this question. In the village level red Burgundy and in the Premier Cru Chablis, did you think you were tasting primarily Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, or did you think you were primarily tasting Burgundy or Chablis? That gets to the heart of what this bullet point about transcending variety is all about. Because it's totally fine if you say, well, obviously I'm drinking Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, I get it. But if you go to Burgundy, don't say that to a winemaker. Any winemaker, they would tell you can make Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. That's not the point here. The point they're making is that Pinot Noir and Chardonnay as varieties are used for as a vehicle, the expression of the place where they come from. We talked at the top about how the INAO's Burgundy hierarchy of quality is about geography. And this comes back to that point. Does this wine taste like it's a varietal Pinot Noir that you might pull off a shelf and it says Pinot Noir in front of it? Or does it tell a story about something more than just the variety? Is there a story here about place? Burgundy is the region which boasts more than any other region that when you taste our wines, you can taste place. And so what they're really saying is we need a variety to do that. Of course, it's still wine. We have to have a great variety, but really that's secondary consideration to the expression of place. So if you feel that there is a sense of place especially in the village level red wine and the Premier Cru Chablis, then that would be a wine which I would consider to be transcending variety, because the story it's telling us is a story about more than just the grape variety from which it is made. And that, to me, the ability to transcend the variety in that way is a huge statement about the quality of a wine. Philip is saying that his wines are Burgundy first. Albert is saying both the Chablis for him were very Chablis-like. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the next point. Well, let's skip to typicity, because that is clearly connected. Typicity or typicality. Some people say typicality, but I just think it's an ugly word. I think typicity is an elegant word that says the same thing. So typicity is also about place. Does your wine, like Alberto just said, is your wine a Chablis-like Chablis? If it is, now many people consider that a virtue in wine. Likewise, but what's more important than just place here is also about the variety. Is this a typical Pinot Noir, typical Chardonnay? Again, we just said in the context of Burgundy, that's less important. But if we were going to apply these quality standards to different wines from any variety, from anywhere in the world, is this also a typical example of the variety? Now, you guys have heard me say before that I do think that this typicity thing is controversial. Why should we say that a wine which is typical of where it comes from be straight away and immediately and obviously superior to examples which are not? Who says that typicity should be so highly prized? I see the commercial reasons for it, which is that if a wine says Chablis on the label, the consumer is being made a promise. It's like a brand saying you can have a certain expectation of what you're about to get, and this bottle will deliver it. I get that. But I guess the issue that people have, particularly more natural wine-minded people, would be that it limits the permissible expression of the variety or the place. So I think it is a controversial one, but typicity applies both to variety and to place. The transcending variety is literally leaving behind the variety where the place takes over. So Amber's commenting, the basic Chablis and the Bourgogne Rouge scream more Burgundy to me than the higher levels, okay? The acidity, the low alcohol, the fruit, etc. The high quality Premier and Village Cru, Village wine are good and undoubtedly high quality, but I feel like so many other regions have raised their game that it's hard to say that it's not a high quality Chardonnay and Pinot from somewhere else. Sure. So one of the things about the lower level wines, the Bourgogne Rouge and the Chablis Village, is that I would argue, Amber, is that not many regions can produce that style of wine at the lower level precisely because they're too warm. We've talked about ripeness. Ripeness and quality seem to go hand in hand. So the higher up the quality pyramid you get in Burgundy, generally the more ripeness there is. But I think the point you're making is at those levels, then you could confuse it with maybe German Pinot Noir, or maybe with New Zealand Pinot Noir, or Australia, or maybe the US. Whereas at Bourgogne Rouge level, who makes that crunchy, high acid Pinot Noir from a cool climate like Bourgogne Rouge is? Not many people. Maybe that's your point. I'm putting words in your mouth, Amber. I don't know whether that's what you mean, but I think it is very relevant that at that very cool climate register, the lower levels can sometimes tell more of a story about the place. Because, and this is really the ultimate point, when we're doing any assessment of place, the first thing to consider is the climate. The climate is the first and most important element in terroir. Now, that does give me a little bit of a segue into talking about the third bullet point from the bottom. Cool climate wines, like the ones we're dealing with here, do lend themselves to the virtues which I've described in that bullet point: precision, detail, subtlety. But you can also have these virtues, maybe not so apparently, but in warmer climates as well. So let me just go through them. Precision and detail are quite similar, but precision and detail mean that you can taste every flavor distinctly. That you get one flavor there and another flavor there, another flavor there. It's like it's pixelated. To me, that's a virtue because it allows you to taste all the complexity of flavors going on in the wine. simple one-dimensional wines, all the flavors just seem to smudge together. It's like having an artist palette and just getting a paintbrush and mixing up all the colors so they just become some kind of gray. Whereas in the precision and detail, you can see each palette, each color on the palette laid out clearly. I remember I was taught this lesson very vividly when I was in Bordeaux. We were at Chateau Cheval Blanc, obviously great place to taste, and we were doing a little vertical. It was just like 3 or 4 vintages. It was like 2012, 2011, 2010, and maybe 2009. And of those vintages, in my opinion, 2010 is the best. And so we tasted backwards order. So we had 2012 first, which is a decent but not great vintage, and likewise 2011. It's still Cheval Blanc. You're like, oh well, these are pretty damn good wines, pretty impressive. But then what happened when we got to 2010 was that all the flavors seemed to be perfectly etched and detailed, and I was astonished. The best thing I could compare it to would be like me being blind, wearing my glasses. I'm short-sighted, right? So I can actually see the computer screen, but I can't see what's over there. I have to wear my glasses when I'm driving. But when I put on my glasses to see things a long distance away, suddenly everything gets clear. I was blind, but now I see. And it was just like that experience with the 2010 Cheval Blanc. Everything was a bit smudgy in the 2012 and 2011, but suddenly in 2010, which is just an amazing vintage where the acidity and the tannins and everything are perfect, the crystalline purity of the expression of the flavors just blew me away. And that's where I really learned the power of precision and detail in a wine, which in turn lend themselves to subtlety. Because again, there's no space for subtlety if everything is just a big model of flavors. So if you have precision and detail, then subtlety will probably follow as well. And I think subtlety is good because you don't want a big blast of flavor always. You want to be able to detect quiet notes as well. The piano in the orchestra, not just the forte. And then the final point is beauty. Now, when we're in the presence, if we're going home on a Tuesday night and we're tired and we just want to open a bottle of wine, and you know, it's COVID time, we all need a bit of reassuring. Probably beauty is not a category that we're thinking about in our $20 or $30 wine. But in the case of the world's best wines, the world's wines that transcend their variety, that tell a story about place, it can also be relevant to bring this category of beauty into play, to acknowledge aloud and to yourself, this is a beautiful wine. Beautiful meaning, to my mind, that it sums up all of the virtues that we've just described. Yes, it's complex and it's long and it's got great concentration and it's got the potential for a long life ahead of it. But putting all those things together and then transcending them is another category entirely, which is beauty, which is we can't always describe it very well, but we know when we see it. And we've all had those moments in our wine experiences, and perhaps that's why many of us work in wine now, that a wine has stopped us in our tracks. And often I think that's because of beauty. Balance is a good thing in a wine, but no one said, oh, I'm going to start working in the wine business because this wine is so balanced. But they said it about beauty because beauty is a different category which brings all the other categories to consummation. So if you are in the presence of a wine like that, then a truly beautiful wine is very likely to be a very, very good, great, outstanding wine. And so it's important to identify it. If the language seems a bit poetic, yes, that's intentionally so, but we shouldn't shy away from that. We shouldn't feel awkward, I don't think, about admitting that. So again, the top 7 points you can apply to any style of wine from any region, any variety. The bottom 5 points are much more relevant for more ambitious wines, maybe from classic regions of origin, made from the best grape varieties. So deploy those when you should. Okay, so let me just flip forward to some final points that I want to make before we wrap up here. Let's just take a step back and look at what we've done today. I know I've worked you guys hard. It's been a little bit dry looking through all those categories. It's not the most fun thing to do. It's a bit dull. But if you can get the shorthand in your head, you know, for concentration, intensity, length, aromatic expression, things like that, it will come a bit easier to you. All the rest of what we're going to talk about in quality. And it gives us a shared language, a shared vocabulary as well. And then those final categories as well, just the ability to step up our language, to elevate our vocabulary when we're in the presence of a wine that really deserves it and demands it. We need to have a different list of talking points that are going to be relevant for higher quality examples. Okay, so I think we have seen there is a step up for most of us from the Bourgogne Rouge through the Village Wine through the Premier Cru. I know that many of you did have wines that were a bit closed. I would urge you to go back to them later tonight or tomorrow, check in on them, see how they're doing, see whether they've opened up any more. But just bear in mind that comparison I was making between wines that are immediately obvious and open and flattering, and those ones which might take a little bit more time to emerge, but which will ultimately be more age-worthy. Ripeness, it seems so simple and so obvious, but ripeness is the precondition for so many other quality factors. Really hard for a wine to be really complex if it's not ripe, really. Concentration goes out the window as well, length probably as well. So again, I repeat what I said, we often take ripeness for granted. It's not still in many parts of the world, particularly in the old world, in Europe. So don't forget it, even though it's obvious, just don't forget to talk about it. We talked about concentration of fruit, whether it's kind of watery or just pure fruit focused, deep fruit. But remember, Pinot Noir especially is such a great example of where you don't have to have massive density in your wines to make great wines. This is often a criticism labeled at certain wine critics. They want every wine to be massive and dense. But you see in the quality categories, the factors that I listed, there's no place for that, because that's not obviously going to give you better quality wines. But talking about things like intensity of flavor might be a better key than to think about density or weight of a wine. Another great question which I like to think about is, what story does this wine tell? You know, we talked about how some wines can transcend their variety, particularly relevant in, you know, these classic regions of origin in Europe, but it doesn't have to be just Europe. It can also be from the New World as well. Is this a story being told about a certain style of winemaking, or about how glorious a certain variety is? Or, you know, perhaps, as we sort of were approaching today, something about place, something about how this wine could only come from a certain place. These stories, it's just another way of phrasing it. It gets your mind to think in a slightly different way. What's this wine trying to tell me? What's the story it has? Having also said all this stuff about the Burgundy hierarchy and the INAO and all this kind of stuff, Burgundy, more than any other region, is one that needs a good producer. When you guys are in Burgundy and you've had too many drinks, then you have to ask your drinking companions who are Burgundy experts, say to them, what's the breakdown between producers in Burgundy who are making wines that deserve the reputation and the price that Burgundy wines go for, versus those ones, quite frankly, who are falling short? What's the percentage breakdown? I mean, really, at best, it's 50-50. In reality, it may be a lot less than that. In order for these stories to be told about variety or place, you have to have a good producer. And like I was saying about Loire, the very best producers can transcend the hierarchy by overachieving, often at the bottom. So in terms of the top 7 points about the quality factors, good wines, you can say moderate or high levels of all of them, but the best wines you have to go onto that secondary list of those final 5 factors. So think about that as well. Do I need to move on from my 7 to my 5 additional? And finally, the X factor. The X factor is really what I was getting at with my beauty point. The X factor in wine is when you're like, I can't quite put my finger on it, but this wine is so bloody good, you know? And that can often just be all the technical quality factors that we've been talking about today in rather dry and abstract terms. They're all there, but there's something more as well, something just brilliant about the wine. That's what I call the X factor. So when you're in the presence of really great wine, don't be alarmed if you can't exactly express why it's so good, because that could just be the X factor. But that is something which is reserved for the very best wines. Okay, guys, so we are going to stay on the topic of geography next week, but just with a slightly broader remit rather than just the very small area of Burgundy. So that's going to be interesting. We'll explore a bit more about geography. And what I'm going to do in each one of these sessions is that each session will build on the last. So I'm going to introduce some new elements to consider in our assessment of quality in each session. So it will not just be a repetition of this session, just applied to different regions. We're going to talk about some other elements as well that we have not mentioned at all today. So same time next week. I hope to see you then. Thanks, guys.